In the summer of 1944, the war in Europe was burning toward its peak. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The German army was retreating, and across the Atlantic, America's heartland was still covered in golden wheat and quiet towns that seemed untouched by the chaos overseas. But soon, those same quiet towns would become home to the strangest guests imaginable: captured enemy soldiers. By mid-1944, German prisoners of war were arriving in the United States by the tens of thousands. Captured in North Africa, Italy, and France, they were loaded onto troop ships and sent across the ocean, not to prison camps behind barbed wire in Europe, but to America itself. The United States had no choice. There were too many POWs for Britain to hold. By the end of the year, over 425,000 Axis prisoners, mostly Germans, were scattered across America, from the forests of Wisconsin to the deserts of Arizona. And what awaited them wasn't punishment. It was something far stranger: kindness. The first group stepped off their train cars in the heart of the Midwest: Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska. For men who had spent years surrounded by rubble and hunger, the sight was surreal. Neat farmhouses, green fields, children waving from fences. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "It looked like a painting of peace. A country that did not know war. The U.S. government needed labor. Millions of American men were fighting overseas, leaving behind vast shortages on the farms and in the factories that fed the nation." The Geneva Convention allowed POWs to work, not as slaves, but as paid laborers. So, the War Department proposed something unthinkable: send captured German soldiers to help American farmers harvest their crops. At first, the farmers resisted. Newspapers warned of Hitler's men arriving in the countryside. Local sheriffs promised tighter patrols. Some church leaders protested, saying, "We cannot feed the enemy while our boys die abroad." But when the harvest came, and there were no men left to bring it in, fear gave way to necessity. The prisoners arrived under armed guard, marched in groups to the fields, and handed simple tools: shovels, sacks, baskets, pitchforks. They were told, "Work, and you'll be treated fairly." And so they did. Rows of corn and wheat soon bent beneath hands that had once held rifles. Many of the German prisoners were young, barely 20 years old, captured in Africa or Italy. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also sons of farmers. They knew the feel of soil, the rhythm of planting and harvest. For some, it was the first time they had touched earth that wasn't torn apart by bombs. They began to whistle as they worked, exchanging shy glances with the American laborers beside them. At first, no one spoke, but gradually the silence softened. An English word here, a German phrase there. Gut. Okay. Ja. Thank you. And somewhere between the rows of wheat, the first bridge between enemies began to form. At night, the prisoners returned to their camps, fenced, guarded, but nothing like the fearsome prisons they had imagined. They slept in wooden barracks with stoves and showers, ate 3 meals a day, even played soccer in the evenings. American guards often treated them with unexpected civility. One German sergeant wrote in a letter home, "If this is captivity, then I fear what freedom has become in Europe." But what would shock them most wasn't the camps. It was the people waiting beyond the fences, because soon those American farmers, the very people whose sons they were supposed to be fighting, began to invite them into their homes. It happened one afternoon in Nebraska, in the small farming town of York County. The sun was low, and the wheat shimmered in gold waves that stretched to the horizon. A group of German POWs was loading the last bales of hay onto a truck, working quietly under the watch of 2 American guards. One of them, a farmer named Henry Thompson, watched from his porch. He was in his 50s, his eldest son fighting somewhere in France, his youngest helping him manage the land. For months he had worked beside these same prisoners. They were polite, efficient, and never caused trouble. That day, as they packed the final load, he noticed one of them, a tall young man named Eric, pause and wipe sweat from his face. Eric muttered something in German, and Henry's foreman translated roughly, "He says it reminds him of harvest back home." Henry didn't reply at first. He simply nodded. Then, almost without thinking, he said, "You boys hungry? Dinner's ready." The guards hesitated, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Henry gestured toward the house. "Bring 'em in," he said. "They've worked hard enough." The scene inside was surreal. 6 German soldiers, prisoners of war, sitting at a wooden farmhouse table across from an American family whose son was fighting their army overseas. The guards stood at the door, uncertain. Henry's wife, Margaret, placed a bowl of potatoes in front of them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one of the Germans quietly said, "Danke," and she smiled, just faintly, and replied, "You're welcome." That night, the sound of conversation filled the house. Broken English, broken German, laughter that began cautiously but grew warmer with every passing minute. They compared stories of home, villages in Bavaria, and farms in Iowa that sounded more alike than either side had imagined. The food disappeared faster than Margaret could serve it. When they were finished, Henry poured each of them a cup of weak coffee and said, "You're far from home, same as my boy. Let's pray they all make it back." The Germans bowed their heads. One of them whispered, "Amen." Word of the dinner spread through the town like wildfire. Some neighbors were furious, others curious. "How could you feed the enemy?" they demanded. Henry's answer was simple. "I didn't feed the enemy. I fed hungry men." And though no one admitted it out loud, more farmers began to do the same. Soon, similar dinners began happening across America. In Texas, POWs helped harvest cotton. In Michigan, they picked apples. In Georgia, they repaired fences and plowed fields. And everywhere they went, suspicion slowly turned to conversation. The transformation was quiet but profound. By sharing bread, America was teaching something far greater than politics or ideology. It was showing mercy, something many of those young Germans had never seen before. One POW, Karl Weber, later wrote in his journal, "We expected hatred. What we found was dignity. We were still prisoners, but no longer enemies." For some of the guards, the change was personal too. They had lost brothers in the Battle of the Bulge, yet found themselves laughing with men who might have been on the other side of that fight. When asked how he could bear it, one guard replied, "You can't hate a man who thanks you for a meal." By the end of 1944, dinners like Henry Thompson's had become almost routine. Camp officers turned a blind eye as POWs were invited into American homes for holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, even New Year's. They ate turkey, sang carols, and traded stories through translation and gestures. A German sergeant described his first Christmas in captivity. "We sang Silent Night in our language. They joined in theirs. For a moment, there were no uniforms, no war, only the song. But not everyone approved. Letters poured into local newspapers condemning such unpatriotic behavior. One headline read, "Farmers Breaking Bread with Hitler's Men." The War Department even investigated several farms for potential overfamiliarity. Yet, when officials visited, they found order, gratitude, and respect. No one had escaped. No one had caused harm. The prisoners returned to their camps each night, often leaving behind thank-you notes or hand-carved gifts made from scrap wood. Kindness, it turned out, was the strongest guard of all. In the months that followed, Henry's dinner table became a quiet symbol, a story told in whispers among farmers from Kansas to Kentucky. It was never meant to be defiance. It was humanity, hidden in plain sight. As one American farmer wrote in a letter to his son overseas, "We took care of their boys while they had ours. Maybe that's how this madness ends. By the start of 1945, something remarkable was happening across America. What had begun as a wartime labor solution was turning into a quiet social experiment, one that no government planner had expected. In small towns across Kansas, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Texas, the fences around POW camps were beginning to look less like prison walls and more like boundaries of routine. Guards greeted prisoners by name. Children waved to them from bicycles as they marched to the fields. And on Sunday afternoons, when work was done, music drifted from inside the wire. Guitars, harmonicas, and the occasional accordion echoing through the farmland. Locals called it the Camp of Friendship. Officially, the camps remained military installations strictly regulated under the Geneva Convention. But in practice, they began to resemble miniature towns. The prisoners built libraries, taught English classes, and organized sports leagues. American chaplains even held joint church services, where guards and prisoners prayed under the same roof. One chaplain in Oklahoma wrote, "I came to minister to soldiers. I did not expect to learn forgiveness from them." The German POWs adapted quickly. Many had been conscripts, farmers, carpenters, students before the war. Inside the camps, they began planting vegetable gardens, repairing fences, even painting murals on barracks walls. Some wrote plays, others translated American books into German. In Camp Algona, Iowa, the prisoners constructed a full-scale nativity scene out of plaster and wood for Christmas, complete with life-sized figures, all sculpted by hand. The display became so popular that locals came from miles around to see it. By the time the war ended, over 40,000 visitors had walked through those gates, not to gawk at prisoners, but to admire their craftsmanship. As the months passed, the relationship between townspeople and POWs deepened. Farmers who had once refused to speak German now practiced the language to better communicate. Women brought baked goods to the work sites. Children traded postcards and candy through the fence. In return, the prisoners carved toys from wood, whittled chess pieces, and painted scenes of the countryside they worked in. One local boy from Illinois later said, "My first toy truck was made by a German soldier. He told me it would roll better if I believed it would." For the towns that hosted them, the POWs became a part of daily life, quietly, naturally, as if they had always been there. And yet, behind that civility lay something profound. The Germans were confronting a truth they had been shielded from under Hitler's propaganda. They had been told Americans were barbaric, violent, without culture or compassion. But here they were, sitting in classrooms, being taught by American teachers, eating meals prepared by American families, earning fair wages for honest labor. One former Luftwaffe mechanic later recalled, "We expected cruelty. What we found was decency. It destroyed everything we had been told to believe." The guards, too, began to see the transformation. A sergeant from Camp Hearn, Texas, wrote, home to his wife, "You look at them long enough, and you stop seeing the enemy. You see tired boys, just like ours. They talk about going home. So do we." In time, even the army relaxed. The armed escorts that once accompanied prisoners to the fields began to disappear. Instead, the POWs rode into town in open trucks, singing and waving. Some were trusted enough to repair equipment at local farms unsupervised, always returning before sundown. And then came a turning point: the exchange of letters. Under Red Cross supervision, the German POWs were allowed to write home, 3 letters and 4 postcards per month. But soon, letters began arriving not just from Germany, but from American families. Farmers sent photographs of harvests, children, and church gatherings to their former POW laborers. In return, those same men mailed drawings, poetry, and photographs of themselves, smiling, free within captivity. These exchanges created bonds that would last long after the war ended. Some of those letters still survive today, yellowed and fragile, filled with words like "Danke," "friend," and "remember us." One story from Minnesota tells of Friedrich, a 24-year-old captured in Tunisia. He worked for a farmer named Eleanor Johnson, whose husband was overseas. Friedrich helped repair the barn roof one spring afternoon, and as thanks, she invited him to sit on the porch for lemonade. They talked for hours about weather, harvests, and families left behind. He spoke of his mother's cooking. She spoke of her fear for her husband. Years later, her daughter found a letter Friedrich had sent after repatriation. "You showed me that the world was not what our leaders said. When I rebuild my home, I will build it with the kindness you taught me." But even in these moments of humanity, war still lingered. Many POWs had lost everything. Homes bombed, families displaced, entire towns erased. They carried guilt, confusion, and grief. Some refused invitations to dine, fearing they didn't deserve them. Others wept at the sound of church bells, reminders of cities that no longer had any. Yet, despite all of it, they worked, they learned, and they healed. Slowly, quietly, surrounded by the people they were once told to hate. By 1945, America had become home to the largest network of POW camps in the world, over 700 in total. And in nearly every one, something extraordinary was happening. Enemies were becoming neighbors. And in the process, both sides were rediscovering their humanity. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. The radio in every American farmhouse carried the same headline: "The Allies were closing in on Berlin." And in the quiet fields of the Midwest, the German POWs could feel it too. They stopped singing as they worked. Their jokes grew softer. Every letter from home arrived like a breath held too long. Some brought joy, a mother still alive, a sister safe. Others came as black-edged telegrams, bearing words that turned strong men silent. For many, this was the hardest part of captivity. Knowing the war was ending, but having no home left to return to. In the camps, letters became lifelines. Each one carried across oceans, translated by censors, and delivered weeks late. But the words still mattered. "My dearest son, the house is gone, but the apple tree still stands. Your father has not been heard from since January. We pray that the Americans are treating you well." They were, and in ways that surprised even the prisoners themselves. The U.S. Army had learned that idle men grow restless, and restless men cause trouble. So, they turned the camps into classrooms. By mid-1945, over half of all German POWs in America were attending education programs designed by the War Department and supervised by university professors. There were classes in English, mathematics, history, and even philosophy. The purpose was twofold: keep the men occupied and prepare them for the world after Hitler. At first, some resisted, dismissing the classes as re-education. But curiosity proved stronger than pride. They read American newspapers, debated democracy, and studied the Constitution. One POW later wrote, "It was the first time we had read freely, without fear of who might be listening." One camp in Wisconsin even held nightly film screenings. Prisoners watched movies like It's a Wonderful Life and The Grapes of Wrath. Many sat in silence afterward, stunned by what they saw. A nation where citizens criticized their own government, where farmers argued openly, where police answered to mayors, not dictators. It was the opposite of everything they had been taught to believe. Freedom, they realized, wasn't chaos. It was conversation. Letters home began to change in tone. Early ones were formal, distant, written by soldiers. But by 1945, they read more like the words of men rediscovering themselves. They treat us fair here. I did not expect that. I am beginning to understand why they fight so hard for what they call liberty. If we ever rebuild Germany, I hope we build it this way. These messages, though censored, carried something more powerful than propaganda. They carried perspective, and for many Germans, it was the first glimpse of a world beyond obedience and fear. Meanwhile, the bonds with local Americans grew stronger. Farmers sent letters of their own to the camps, thanking the men for their help and wishing them well. Children drew pictures of tractors and airplanes, scrawling the words, "Good luck, Hans," or "Come back someday." Some families even petitioned the government to let certain POWs stay after the war. But the Geneva Convention was clear. When the conflict ended, they had to go home. The thought of leaving America filled many of them with both joy and sorrow. They wanted to see their families again. But they also knew they were leaving behind something irreplaceable. The place where they had learned what peace could look like. In one of the most famous examples, a group of prisoners in Alabama built a chapel from scrap wood and stone. Above its door, they carved a simple inscription in German, "Built by enemies in the land of freedom." When the camp was dismantled, the townspeople preserved it. To this day, that chapel still stands, a quiet monument to reconciliation. The guards, too, had changed. Many had begun the war hating the men behind the wire. But by its end, they found themselves defending them. One sergeant wrote in his final report, "They are not Nazis anymore. They are farmers, teachers, and sons, just like the ones we lost." When VE Day was announced on May 8, 1945, the camps erupted. The prisoners cheered, cried, and sang, not in triumph, but in release. They lined up to shake hands with their guards, thanking them for decency instead of punishment. That night, one POW orchestra performed a joint concert for guards and locals. The final song was "Home on the Range." Halfway through, the German chorus joined in, their accents thick but their voices clear. It was more than a melody. It was an ending and a beginning. As the weeks passed, rumors spread that the men would soon be shipped back to Europe. Some began writing farewell letters to their American hosts. Many enclosed photos. Men standing in front of barns, holding tools instead of rifles. One such letter, preserved in a Nebraska museum, reads, "When I came here, I thought you were my enemy. When I leave, I think of you as my teacher." For America, it was a quiet victory, not won on battlefields, but at dinner tables, in fields, and in hearts. The war was over, but for the men behind the fences, the end didn't feel like freedom. It felt like uncertainty. The news of Germany's surrender reached the camps on a warm May morning. At first, there was silence, then scattered applause, then tears. A few sang Lily Marlene, softly at first, then louder, until even the guards stopped and listened. Others simply stared at the ground, unsure how to feel. Their homeland was in ruins, their army defeated, their leaders dead or captured, and soon they would be sent back to what was left. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, an American officer stood before hundreds of German prisoners and read the message aloud. "Hostilities in Europe have ceased. You will soon be repatriated according to the terms of the Geneva Convention." To the prisoners, it was the moment they had prayed for and dreaded. They wanted to go home, yes, but what home was left? Many had not heard from their families in months. Rumors spread of bombed cities, starving civilians, Soviet occupation zones. Some men had wives or children they hadn't seen in years. Others no longer had anyone at all. One diary entry from a prisoner in Texas read, "They say we are free now, but freedom means going home to ghosts." As the repatriation process began, The atmosphere inside the camps shifted. Guards no longer patrolled with rifles. Work details were reduced. The prisoners spent their days packing small wooden boxes with carvings, letters, and the few keepsakes they were allowed to take. Friendships formed over years of labor were suddenly facing their final sunset. In Nebraska, farmer Henry Thompson, the same man who had once invited POWs to dinner, received a letter stamped Camp Concordia. It was from Eric, the young prisoner who had worked his fields. "I thank you for the bread and the kindness. I will never forget the day you called me inside." Henry folded the letter and placed it on the mantel beside his son's war photograph. Both young men had fought on opposite sides, and yet both, somehow, had survived. Transport ships waited in American ports: New York, Boston, Galveston, San Francisco, each one destined for a shattered Europe. But the journey home wasn't immediate. Britain, overwhelmed with rebuilding and prisoner transfers, asked the U.S. to delay the return. So, for months, the POWs remained in limbo. Some were sent to assist with post-war reconstruction, clearing debris, repairing infrastructure, even helping local authorities. They called it working for peace. Others stayed on farms, continuing their harvest duties until replacements arrived. They were no longer guarded as enemies. They were guests finishing a season. In Kansas, one American woman wrote to her congressman asking to keep our German boys a little longer. Her letter was polite but heartfelt. "They came as prisoners and became part of our lives. Let them finish the wheat, then send them home." When the orders finally came, the departures were quiet but emotional. Trains lined up at dawn, their steel sides glinting in the early light. The prisoners, now tanned and lean from years of labor, carried duffel bags filled with drawings, photographs, and trinkets made from scrap wood. Gifts from Americans who had once called them the enemy. Crowds gathered at the platforms. Farmers shook their hands. Children waved flags, not in victory, but farewell. At one camp in Oklahoma, a group of POWs presented their American guards with a carved wooden plaque. It read, "We came as foes. We leave as friends." The voyage home took weeks. The ships crossed the Atlantic slowly, filled with men who stared at the endless water and wondered what waited on the other side. The United States disappeared behind them, a place that had confounded and transformed them. As one wrote in his journal, "We entered America with hate in our hearts. We leave it carrying something we cannot name. Maybe peace, maybe guilt, maybe gratitude." When they finally reached Europe, the shock was overwhelming. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne reduced to ash. Rail lines twisted and broken, fields blackened and silent. Germany was a scar stretching from horizon to horizon. At the docks, Allied officers processed them in long lines, handing out ration cards and brief instructions. "Go home if you can," they were told. For many, there was nowhere to go. Some walked for days, sleeping in barns or ruins. Others returned to find strangers living in their houses. One man reached his village to discover only a crater where his family's home once stood. He sat in the rubble and wept until his uniform froze stiff from the night air. And yet, among that devastation, something else began to bloom. The seed planted in America. Many former POWs spoke of their time in the U.S. as a revelation. They had seen democracy, generosity, and equality, not as slogans, but as daily life. They had eaten beside their captors, read free newspapers, and spoken without fear. Now, they carried those lessons back to a nation that desperately needed them. One former prisoner, Franz Behrendt, later became a mayor in post-war Germany. In his first speech, he told his town, "I learned about rebuilding not from the ruins of Germany, but from the fields of Kansas." Back in America, the absence was felt just as deeply. For years, those enemy soldiers had been part of the rhythm of rural life, plowing, harvesting, repairing. When they were gone, their presence lingered in photographs, in carved gifts, in memories. And every so often, a letter would arrive from across the Atlantic, stamped Deutsche Post, addressed simply, "To my American friends." Decades later, some of those friendships endured. American families traveled to Germany to visit the men who had once been their prisoners. They shared meals again, this time as equals. No guards, no fences, no war. One reunion in 1983 between a farmer's family and their former POW made local headlines. They sat on the same porch where he'd once been offered lemonade, and he said quietly, "Back then, you gave me bread. But what I really took home was how to be human again." For thousands of German POWs, America had been more than a place of captivity. It had been a mirror, showing them what the world could be when mercy replaced hate. And as they rebuilt their homes, they carried that reflection with them, shaping not just their own lives, but the spirit of a new Germany rising from the ashes. In the years after the war, the memories of captivity in America lingered like a haunting melody. Faint, but unforgettable. For the German prisoners who had labored in the wheat fields and cotton farms of the United States, those years behind barbed wire had become something paradoxical, both punishment and salvation. While Europe struggled to rebuild from rubble, these men carried back something intangible, an understanding that dignity could exist even in defeat. They had been treated as human beings at a time when humanity itself seemed lost. And that single fact reshaped how they saw their country, their captors, and even themselves. By 1946, most of the 370,000 German POWs held in the United States had been repatriated. Many returned home with strange habits, saying "thank you" in English, drinking coffee at breakfast, whistling American tunes while working. Some even brought home fragments of Americana, a harmonica, a pocket Bible, a photo of their American host family. Their neighbors were puzzled. These men had left as soldiers and come back as something entirely different, quieter, humbler, more open-minded. One returnee recalled, "I used to believe Germany was the center of the world. In America, I learned the world is wide, and that respect can defeat hate faster than bombs." For many, the lessons learned in captivity became a moral compass for the rest of their lives. They refused to join extremist movements that emerged during post-war chaos. Instead, they became teachers, engineers, doctors, and community leaders, quietly embodying the democratic ideals they had witnessed across the ocean. Some even helped establish local government councils in occupied Germany, encouraging fair elections and transparency, principles they had seen work so effortlessly in American towns. In 1952, a journalist interviewing former POWs noted something remarkable. When they speak of America, their voices change, not with bitterness, but with something close to affection. The gratitude wasn't one-sided. In dozens of small American towns, farmers kept letters from the men who had once worked their land. They arrived from Munich, Bremen, Düsseldorf, written in careful English, filled with thanks and nostalgia. "We remember your family every Christmas. The cornfields are still in my dreams. I tell my children about the kindness of strangers." Some Americans even replied, maintaining correspondence for decades. A few of those letters evolved into lifelong friendships, proof that compassion, once offered, never truly dies. In Camp Hearn, Texas, years after the fences came down, local volunteers erected a small museum. Inside are carvings, letters, and handmade tools left behind by the German prisoners. One display shows a wooden sculpture of two hands shaking. One German, one American. The plaque below reads, "Enemies once, friends forever." Yet, beneath that optimism lay a profound irony, one that historians still marvel at today. While Nazi propaganda had tried to dehumanize the Allied nations, It was the Germans themselves who rediscovered their humanity in captivity abroad. The U.S. government hadn't set out to reform them. It had simply chosen not to treat them with cruelty. And that restraint, that deliberate choice to remain moral even in victory, became America's quiet triumph. One former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed in 1960, said, "We were prepared for humiliation. What disarmed us completely was respect. Not all prisoners adapted so easily. A few returned to Germany and tried to resume their old ways, harsh, authoritarian, suspicious. But even they found themselves changed by small, invisible things. The memory of a Kansas farmer who shared his lunch, a child's laughter through a camp fence, the scent of fresh bread after years of rationed misery. These experiences had burrowed deep into their conscience, altering something that ideology could never reach. In Germany's post-war years, as Marshall Plan aid flowed in, former POWs often became bridges between the two nations. They helped American officials navigate German culture, translating, negotiating, mediating trust. They knew both sides, and both languages, literally and emotionally. Some even hosted American soldiers in their rebuilt homes, serving coffee from the same tin mugs they had used in prison camps years before. It wasn't forgiveness alone that drove them. It was recognition. They had seen the best of their enemy and wanted to live up to it. By the 1950s, German newspapers began publishing memoirs of captivity in America. Titles like Fields of Freedom, The Good Enemy, and Prisoners of Kindness filled bookstore shelves. The tone was consistent, reflective, not bitter. Their pages described not just fences and barracks, but warmth and learning, laughter and trust. One best-selling account by a former Luftwaffe pilot began with a single line that summed it all up. "I went to America as a prisoner, and left it as a believer, not in religion, but in humanity." For the American towns that had hosted them, these stories brought quiet pride. Old farmers who had shared coffee with POWs now realized they'd been part of something far greater than they ever knew. A moment of compassion that echoed across oceans and generations. In 1978, when a group of former German POWs revisited their old camp in Alabama, they found it overgrown with grass and silence. But when the townspeople heard they had returned, they came out in droves, some with gray hair, some with children of their own. They greeted the former prisoners like family. No apologies, no resentment, just handshakes, tears, and stories that began with, "Do you remember the harvest of '44? One American woman, now in her 80s, recalled, "We fed them because it was right. But we never thought feeding them would feed us, too. Feed our sense of decency, our faith in who we were." That, perhaps, was the deepest legacy of all, that even in war, the smallest acts of kindness could outlive the guns and the flags. By the 1960s, 2 decades had passed since the last German POW boarded a ship from American shores. The world had changed, but the memory of that unlikely chapter, when enemies dined together and trust grew behind barbed wire, refused to fade. Germany was no longer the shattered ruin the prisoners had returned to. It was rebuilding, reborn through industry, democracy, and resilience. Factories hummed again, schools reopened, and children who had never known war played in streets once filled with rubble. And quietly, within this new generation, a strange connection began to take root. One their fathers could hardly explain. A connection not born of blood or politics, but of gratitude. In 1964, a young German student named Klaus Richter visited the United States as part of a cultural exchange. His father had been a POW in Louisiana, working on a sugar plantation during the final year of the war. Before Klaus boarded the ship, his father handed him a faded photograph. 6 men in ragged uniforms sitting beside an American farmer. On the back, in careful English, were the words, "To Mr. and Mrs. Allen, you showed us what kindness is." When Klaus arrived in New Orleans, he set out to find the family. It took weeks of letters, phone calls, and small-town inquiries. But eventually, he did. He met the Allens' daughter, now a middle-aged woman, who burst into tears at the sight of the photo. "My father always wondered if any of them made it home," she said. That evening, they ate together, gumbo and cornbread, and talked long into the night. Different accents, different histories, but the same warmth that had crossed a language barrier 20 years before. Stories like Klaus's weren't isolated. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, dozens of German families reached out to the Americans who had shown their fathers compassion during captivity. Some wrote letters. Others made pilgrimages across the Atlantic. In 1972, the Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story titled, "Ex-POWs Return to Thank the Farmers Who Fed Them." The article described a Kansas town that held a small parade for 3 German veterans who had come back to visit their former work site. They were greeted with hugs, tears, and a banner that read, "Welcome home, boys, again." One of the men, now a retired schoolteacher, said simply, "When I was here last, I was the enemy. Today I am a friend. That is America." These reunions became small but powerful symbols of reconciliation between 2 nations that had once fought to destroy each other. They weren't orchestrated by diplomats or politicians. They were born from memory, humility, and shared humanity. As Cold War tensions grew, these stories offered something rare, proof that peace could last when it was built on respect rather than fear. The former POWs became unexpected ambassadors, telling their communities that Americans were not the monsters Nazi propaganda had described. Instead, they spoke of ordinary people who treated them with fairness, even when they didn't have to. One of the most remarkable legacies came from Camp Algona in Iowa. During the war, prisoners there had built a detailed nativity scene out of plaster and wood. Over 60 hand-carved figures, painted with extraordinary care. After the camp closed, the townspeople preserved it and displayed it every Christmas. By the 1970s, thousands came to see it each year, a masterpiece created by the hands of men once called enemies. For locals, it became more than art. It was a reminder that beauty could grow even inside a prison. Meanwhile, in Germany, many former POWs were teaching their children about the war, not through tales of battle, but through lessons of compassion. They told them about the Americans who shared food, the guards who smiled, the farmers who treated them as men instead of monsters. When their sons and daughters visited the United States years later, they sought out those towns not as tourists, but as pilgrims, walking through the same streets, standing by the same barns, whispering quiet thanks to strangers long gone. Some even carried small tokens, medals, carvings, or folded flags to leave behind as gestures of remembrance. In the 1980s, the U.S. and West Germany were close allies, bound by defense treaties and trade. But beneath the politics, there was a deeper, more personal alliance, one built decades earlier on kindness. Many historians would later argue that the humane treatment of German POWs in America helped lay the emotional groundwork for post-war partnership between the 2 nations. The Germans trusted America not because of speeches or aid packages, but because of memory, because of the meals shared on quiet farms, because of the laughter that survived war. At a veterans gathering in 1989, an elderly German man approached a retired American sergeant who had once guarded a camp in Arkansas. He carried a wooden box and placed it in the sergeant's hands. Inside was a small carving, 2 wheat stalks intertwined. The man said, his voice trembling, "You gave us bread. We give you thanks." The sergeant, overcome with emotion, whispered, "We only did what anyone should." But they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have, and that was precisely why it mattered so much. As decades passed and both generations aged, their stories became part of museums, documentaries, and school lessons. Students learned not only about battles like Normandy and Stalingrad, but about quiet fields in Texas and barns in Nebraska, where enemies learned to trust each other again. For every great war has its unsung piece, and this, perhaps, was America's greatest one. In one final letter written in 1992, a former POW from Bremen summed it all up better than any historian could. The fences are gone, the camps are gone, but the kindness remains. You can rebuild cities with steel and stone, but to rebuild the soul of a nation, you need forgiveness. By the dawn of the 1990s, most of the men who had once worn gray Wehrmacht uniforms and khaki prison overalls were old. Their hair had turned white, their hands trembled with age, and the world they once fought in seemed like a dream fading with every sunrise. But for many of them, one final journey remained unfinished. The return to the land where they had once been prisoners, and where they had learned, perhaps for the first time, what mercy looked like. In 1994, 50 years after D-Day, America and Europe marked the anniversary of liberation with grand parades and speeches. Presidents and generals spoke of sacrifice, courage, and victory. But far from the cameras, smaller, quieter reunions took place across the heartland. On old farms, beside forgotten barracks, and in churches where both German and American veterans prayed side by side. One such reunion happened in Concordia, Kansas, where Camp Concordia once held over 4,000 German prisoners. The site was now little more than an open field dotted with crumbling foundations and rusted wire. But on that June morning, nearly a dozen elderly Germans arrived, some walking with canes, others in wheelchairs, each clutching a small bundle of photographs, letters, or soil from home. Waiting to greet them were the farmers who had once hired them, now gray-haired themselves, and the children of guards who remembered hearing stories about the good Germans. They shook hands, they embraced, and then they wept, not out of guilt or regret, but out of something purer: recognition. One of the former POWs, Heinrich Heinz Müller, stood beside the remnants of the old mess hall and read from a yellowed page of his diary. August 1944. Today, we harvested wheat until sunset. The farmer gave us cold water and a slice of bread. I have never tasted anything so kind. When he finished reading, silence hung heavy over the crowd. Then an old American farmer named George stepped forward, hat in hand, and said softly, "I think that bread came from my wife's kitchen." Heinz smiled through tears. "Then she fed more than just me," he said. "She fed my heart." These small reunions began to multiply. Former prisoners visited Texas, Iowa, Arkansas, and Louisiana, tracing the landscapes of their captivity like pilgrims visiting holy ground. They brought their children and grandchildren, wanting them to see the America they had spoken about for decades. For the younger generations, it was difficult to understand. How could a prison camp be remembered with affection? How could captivity turn into gratitude? But as they listened to their fathers' stories about the kindness of strangers, the laughter shared over simple meals, the dignity restored by fairness, they began to understand. At Camp Hearn, Texas, one of the last surviving POW camps, local volunteers had built a small museum to preserve the artifacts left behind. Carved chess sets, miniature tools, hand-painted postcards, and photographs of men smiling despite the wire behind them. When a group of former prisoners visited in 1996, they found their old carvings on display, lovingly labeled with their names. One man leaned in close to the glass and whispered, "I made that with a pocket knife and homesickness." Another, his voice cracked with emotion, said, "We were enemies, but they kept our art safe. Only friends would do that." The media began covering these meetings, calling them the second peace. It wasn't born from treaties or governments, but from memory, from ordinary people refusing to let war have the last word. One American reporter wrote, "These men came to thank their captors, but when you see them together, you realize no one is captive anymore." In Germany, schools began including the POW experience in post-war education. Students learned that more than 370,000 German soldiers had been held in America, and that nearly all of them were treated with dignity, given fair rations, medical care, and education. They learned about American guards who shared cigarettes, farmers who offered coffee, and towns that built churches with the help of prisoners. Teachers emphasized the moral lesson behind the history, that victory without cruelty is possible. That decency can be stronger than hate. In one classroom in Hamburg, a student asked her grandfather, a former POW, what it felt like to live behind enemy fences. He thought for a long time, then said, "At first it felt like the end of my life. Then, slowly, it began to feel like the beginning of it." That one sentence became the opening line of a documentary filmed the following year, Bread and Barbed Wire. It chronicled the lives of the German POWs who had found humanity in America, weaving together diaries, photographs, and interviews. The film premiered in both Berlin and Washington, where veterans from both nations stood for a standing ovation, many wiping tears they didn't bother to hide. By the early 2000s, only a few hundred of the former POWs were still alive. But even as time claimed their voices, their legacy deepened. Grandchildren of both sides continued to exchange letters and visits, maintaining the relationships born in wartime fields and camps. A young German woman named Lena Müller, Heinz's granddaughter, wrote to the family of George, the Kansas farmer, "My grandfather said you taught him the meaning of home. I think that's why he spent his life building them." He became an architect. In response, George's daughter wrote back, "He helped us harvest wheat. We helped him rebuild faith. I guess that's an even trade." When Heinz passed away in 2007, his family found one photograph framed beside his bed. It wasn't of his wife or his home in Bremen, but of the Thompsons' farmhouse in Kansas, the same place he had once eaten that slice of bread in 1944. On the back, he had written a single line in faded ink, "Where I learned to forgive." The war had created millions of graves, but this story created something rarer. A bridge across generations, stronger than hate, built plank by plank with kindness. In a museum display case in Texas, beneath the carved handshake sculpture once made by POWs, there's a final plaque that reads, "History remembers battles, but peace remembers gestures." That is the story the German POWs carried home, and the one their children still tell. That the true victory of World War II wasn't only won by armies, but by the quiet mercy of ordinary people who chose to see the human being behind the uniform.